G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. Hatch lines and cross-hatching lines can feel really mystifying, especially when we're beginning drawing. It's one thing to draw up little square boxes and put lines in different directions. It's a totally different thing to have a scene and to know where to put the lines and how to draw the lines in a way that will reinforce the overall drawing that we're doing in a positive way rather than merely covering up detail and make it harder to see what we've drawn. In this video, I'll show you how. But let's start by looking at what some of the possible hatching lines we could use are. Hatching is simply a series of lines placed very closely together in our drawing for effect. And cross-hatching is where we lay one layer of hatching across an earlier layer of hatching, literally cross-hatching. Now, the hatching and cross-hatching lines can be in any direction. They don't have to be up and down. They could be on the diagonal, such as in this example here. And equally, the angle between the hatching and cross-hatching lines doesn't have to be at 90 degrees. It can be at a more shallow or steeper angle. And the hatching lines also don't have to be equally spaced. We can vary them as here. There's no limit to how many layers of hatching we can place in a drawing on top of earlier layers. And as we can see here, the more layers of hatching we place, the darker the effect. So this is a way of creating quite dark areas. And hatching lines don't have to be straight lines. They can be a series of short lines at any angle as here. And of course the final option is to have no hatching lines at all, and that clearly creates yet another effect. Our second point is that we want our hatching lines to in some way follow the shapes of the objects that they're applied over, to in some way reflect what's happening with the object that they're on. So as an example for this, I'm just very quickly drawing a little tower with a little dome that might be a decoration on a grander roof, though it looks a bit like a salt and pepper shaker here. And I'll indicate the direction of the light. Now I want to apply some hatching to indicate the shadow, as well as the fact that the dome is a darker color. So I'm doing straight lines because these are straight walls, but I'm also doing more lines towards the left to show that the wall is curving away from me. Now on the dome, I put lines over the whole dome to reflect the darker color, but I curve them to the shape of the dome. And I also curve now the hatching lines to indicate the shadow on the dome. And I do the same thing with this extra little towered bit on top of the dome. Now, can you see how this gives a sense of the curving of the cylinder of the drum that the little dome sits on, and also the shape of the dome? Now, let's look at another example where perhaps the cross-hatching is not as sympathetic. So we draw a very similar little tower with a rounded top this time. We'll put the windows in. Now, I often see cross-hatching that looks like this. In this case, I'm simply using cross-hatching over the whole drawing without worrying about what's the shape of the object underneath it. So it indicates shade on the left-hand side of the tower, which is partly what I wanted to do, but it doesn't give us anything stronger. So comparing these two, which one do you think works better? It's important to think carefully before we start hatching. It's not just providing shade, it's also reinforcing the actual shape of the object that the shade or the color is being applied to. My third point in using cross-hatching lines is one that I've never seen anywhere else. So this may be an exclusive Stephen Travers art point. And that's to do with using hashtags to reinforce the perspective of a building. If you've not seen much of my drawing, you may not appreciate that most of that drawing is architectural or streetscape. So I do a lot of buildings and there's a lot of perspective involved. So I'm going to draw the same rectangular box from 4 different positions where the left-hand side of the box is pushed a bit further away with each view. And on the right-hand side, of course, it swings a little bit closer. And I'll put the direction of the light here. And firstly, I do vertical lines to indicate that it's a nice straight wall, but I have them closer together at the left-hand side, which reinforces the foreshortening, which is a perspective principle that I won't go into here. And then I cross-hatch over the top with a nice diagonal line to make it a bit darker. Now, my point you really can only see in comparison as the boxes go down and as this wall tilts further away. I do the same thing with the foreshortening lines, but with the cross-hatching over the top, I make the angle slightly higher than the first one. And as I go down on this wall being pushed further and further away from the viewer, the angle of the cross-hatching line increases because this reflects how these lines would look if they were real lines drawn on the side of the building. As the wall moved further away, the angle would appear to increase. And so I add a fifth one here just to make the point a little sharper. And can you see how it makes sense when we look at how these boxes look with this hatching, that we do get a sense that they're swinging further away the lower down we go. And it's the hatching and the cross hatching which gives that sense. And look, just to make really clear what I'm saying, I'll just illustrate for each of these with just the cross hatching lines so that it's easier to see that I'm tilting upwards with each box as it goes down, higher and higher, these cross hatching lines over the top. And that helps to create the effect of the reality. And drawing is all about creating the effect with pen and with line of what we see in real life. Our fourth point in using hash lines is using them for irregularly shaped objects. They're really helpful not just for strongly geometric forms such as buildings, but really for any shape we're trying to represent. And trees are often an enormous problem for drawers, particularly drawers with ink, where we're not using sort of a fuzzy graphite shade to indicate tone. We can create tone by using our hatching and our cross-hatching lines, but we can also indicate direction and overall shape by the overall pattern that our hatching lines form on the paper. We're not, of course, drawing any leaves when we draw a tree. We're drawing the effect of the leaves, and gum trees particularly have big clumps of leaves on the ends of individual branches, and it's really those big clumps of leaves that capture the light and also therefore create the shadows. And some of these clumps are so big they create shadows in other parts of the tree as well. And so it's important to stand back as we draw a little part and still keep the overall shape of the tree and the way the overall shape of the tree captures the light. But it's using hatching lines to show the form, which is so very important. But they also partly mimic the effect of leaves, and so they're particularly suitable for tree drawing. Now, even the branches, which are a little bit different, still greatly benefit from hatching, because we can use the direction of our hatching lines where the branches are in shadows to show the roundness of the branches. And that can be really helpful, particularly where we're a little bit closer to the tree, perhaps than the tree I'm drawing now. But I have tried to indicate that basically tree canopies are almost completely formed by hatching and cross-hatching. So don't just think of this as something we can use to do the side of a building that's in shade and perhaps some of the shadow that it casts. It's wonderful for irregular organic shapes. And as I said, I can't imagine drawing trees without being able to use hatching because it's so well suited to the shape and the texture of a tree canopy. It's helpful to vary the line lengths as well in our hatching, just to create interest. My fifth point, and an example which will I hope pull most of these elements we've looked at together, is to cross-hatch various elements and planes of a scene separately. Think of them as separate parts. Here we have an entrance of a Victorian house in London that I took a quick photo of as we went past in the bus. And I thought it was a good example to use for this because it has a nice sense of depth going back into this doorway and quite a number of various architectural elements with various elements of shading. Now, I've decided to do this in a very brisk gestural style because that's often how we use cross-hatching. So I thought this would be a good example to put together the various aspects of hatching that we've looked at. So here's the line work. So now we get to apply the hatching and the cross hatching. I often do the darkest areas first because that helps me judge then the areas that aren't as dark more accurately, so that I don't have to keep going back and making adjustments towards the end so much. Now, it is a building. I do tend to favour vertical lines for my hatching because I feel that reinforces the actual form of the building better. And I tend to keep my cross hatching lines at not too much of a contrasting angle for most things. Now, this doorway set right back under the entrance porch is really quite dark, so getting those adjustments, getting the relative values of the various shaded elements in that is quite important. We always discover a bit of line work that we didn't finish as we start to do the tone, I find myself. These front steps are, I think, an important little lesson in that it would be easy just to do these with long horizontal lines rather than all these little vertical lines. But if we do, because they're going in the same direction as the lines, we tend to actually lose the definition between the steps. So sometimes it is worth just doing a little bit of fiddly work. And very rough lines here because I am keeping this nice and brisk. Now, these really black windows are really important to get nice and dark. So there's lots of multiple levels of hatching and cross hatching here. And the little flowers on the window sill are important to do because they're a contrast. We can do lines in totally different directions. Similarly with that pot that's on the porch, even though it's in silhouette, I still took care to do the lines in different directions to the vertical hatching lines of the building so that it stood out and provided contrast. I decided to add the details around the porch that we had in the photo, mostly because I think the really dark tones will add overall to the effect. So having done that, I really am just doing little bits and pieces now, working out what does it need, what do I need to add. I add a bit of line work there on those marble columns just to indicate the local colour rather than shade or shadow. And I decided to put these posts that are across the road. They help frame the scene, but also bring the doorway closer to us on the other side of the road. Well, how do you think it's looking? Do you want to give it a go? I'll put this reference photo on my YouTube community page so you can have a go if you want. Hatching, cross hatching, it's a wonderful skill to develop. Why not give it a go? I'll see you next time. Bye.